Have you ever felt invisible in a place where you should belong? Imagine sitting proudly in a seat you earned, only to be told you don't belong there because of something as unfair as the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened to 11-year-old Eli Rivers on a cross-country flight. Removed from first class by authority figures who refused to see the truth. Now, imagine being the parent, the CEO, the guardian of not only a company worth billions but of a child's dignity, and knowing that the world is watching every choice you make. Would you stay silent, hoping the situation resolves itself? Or would you take immediate action to protect your child and demand justice? What would you do if every passenger's eyes were on you? Every decision weighed with the possibility of changing a system, not just a single seat assignment. Could you remain calm, yet unyielding, as you navigate prejudice, authority, and public scrutiny, all while safeguarding your child's courage and self-respect? This is more than a story about a plane or a seat. It's a story about dignity, fairness, and the courage to demand what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Stay with us, because in the next minutes, you'll witness a mother and son redefining what it means to stand tall and change the skies forever. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of this journey. The moment Eli Rivers stepped into the first-class cabin of Delta Flight 482 from JFK to Los Angeles, his heart was racing, not from fear, but from excitement. 11 years old, neatly dressed in a crisp navy blazer, white shirt tucked into khaki pants, polished sneakers on his feet. Eli held a small leather backpack with his initials embossed in gold. This was his very first solo flight across the country, a chance to feel grown up, responsible, and, most importantly, recognized for the effort he had put into preparing for this journey. But no sooner had he approached Seat 1B than a sharp voice pierced the air. "Get out of that seat right now." "This isn't for kids like you." Heather Lawson, the lead flight attendant, stepped into his path, her polished posture rigid, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of supposed expertise. Her eyes narrowed, scanning Eli as if he were some intruder in a world that did not belong to him. Eli froze, clutching the strap of his backpack. The words weren't whispered. They rang loud enough for nearby passengers to turn, their expressions caught somewhere between surprise and curiosity. Eli's stomach twisted, not because he was afraid of flying, but because he suddenly felt small, misplaced, and judged for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the glint of silver trays, the warm folds of blankets in each seat, the soft murmur of other passengers settling in. The flight attendants moved with choreographed precision, offering towels and drinks, and yet all Eli could hear was Heather's voice, sharp and unyielding, slicing through the calm of the cabin like a cold wind. Young man," she continued, misstepping slightly in her own hesitation, "you need to follow me to economy. Unaccompanied minors don't belong here." Eli swallowed hard, remembering the words his father, Malcolm Rivers, had often told him, "When you're tested, remain calm. Truth speaks louder than shouting." Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his boarding pass from the leather holder. His fingers trembled slightly, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "This is my seat. 1B. My dad confirmed with Delta's VIP desk that I'm allowed to be here." Heather's lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice so it might have seemed private, but the glare in her eyes suggested she intended for everyone to feel the message. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Don't argue with me." She tapped her headset as if signaling the world to back her up. "I need an agent in first class. Child in the wrong seat. No disruptions before takeoff." A hush fell over the cabin. Eli's small frame seemed to shrink in the space, though inside, a quiet resolve began to coil like steel in his chest. He looked at the people sitting around him. Isabella Morales, a Latina freelance journalist in 1C, leaned toward him and whispered, "You're not doing anything wrong. Stay calm." Across the aisle, in seat 1A, George Whitman, a retired businessman in his mid-60s, adjusted his reading glasses. He had flown this route hundreds of times, seen all manner of passenger behavior, and yet he felt an unusual pang of guilt pressing against his chest. He remembered times in college when he had remained silent as classmates were mocked for their skin color. The memory stung, but he said nothing now. Just then, Naomi Fields, a young ground staffer who had been called to verify seating for unaccompanied minors, stepped into the aisle. She swiped her scanner, her eyes scanning the screen with precision. "Confirmed," she announced clearly, her voice carrying over the soft hum of the cabin. "Seat 1B, VIP priority verified, no issues." For a brief moment, the truth rang out like a bell in the quiet. But Heather's expression didn't change. She's still a minor. Policy is policy. Eli's throat tightened. He gripped the strap of his backpack a little harder, trying not to let the sting of humiliation show. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly, the faces of other passengers blurring together as whispers began to rise, some sympathetic, some questioning, none daring to act. Mark Henderson, the first officer, stepped from the cockpit. His uniform was pristine, his jaw set with authority. "What's the problem here?" he asked, scanning the cabin. Heather gestured toward Eli. "He's in the wrong place. Move him to economy. No disruptions before takeoff." Eli's eyes watered, his fingers clutching the leather of his backpack. He felt the tension of authority pressing down upon him, a weight far heavier than his 11-year-old body could carry. Yet he remembered his father's voice calm, unwavering, insisting that dignity and truth are louder than fear. As Heather and Mark guided him down the aisle toward the seat 28E, a section near the emergency exit, Eli's mind raced. He noticed the other children in the cabin, the adults whispering, some shaking their heads, some staring blankly, as though the situation had nothing to do with them. He lowered himself into the seat, pulling out his phone. With a soft whisper into the receiver, he said, "Dad, it's happening. Miles away. Malcolm Rivers, CEO of SkyTech Systems and father to this quiet but determined boy, was sitting in a conference room surrounded by his team." His phone vibrated, and hearing Eli's voice, soft, strained, but resolute, sent a jolt through his body. Memories of being dismissed, of doors closed in his face because of his skin, flooded back. The familiar burn of indignation rose inside him. Malcolm stood abruptly, excusing himself from the meeting. His mind sharpened, focused entirely on the safety and dignity of his son. No negotiation, no matter how important, could compare to this moment. He tapped into his VIP access privileges, pulled up the live feed from the cabin cameras, and saw the scene unfold, Eli being removed from his rightful seat despite verification, while Heather Lawson ignored Naomi's confirmation without hesitation. Malcolm's hands curled into fists. His calm, measured demeanor in billion-dollar negotiations was now ignited into a fire of paternal resolve. No one diminishes his child, No one in the cabin. Eli held back tears, clutching his small backpack and a notebook. He whispered to himself, a mantra from his father and mother echoing through his mind. Truth is stronger than fear. I will not bow, passengers murmured. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered judgments as though the boy's mere presence caused disruption. But Eli sat upright, pen poised above the pages of his journal, a silent but unyielding witness to his own dignity being tested. Outside, Malcolm Rivers maneuvered his black SUV through Manhattan traffic, every second driving him closer to his son, every heartbeat echoing the urgency that only a parent protecting their child can know. 10 minutes to JFK, every light, every honk, every lane change felt like a countdown to justice. Inside the cabin, Eli Rivers drew in a steadying breath, his small hands curled around his pen, and though the ache of humiliation pressed against his chest, he reminded himself courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to hold fast despite it. And somewhere, in 15 minutes, the world would witness what it looked like when truth and power aligned, when Malcolm Rivers stepped onto that jet bridge, and when Eli Rivers's dignity would no longer be questioned. The first-class cabin had quieted for a moment, the hum of the engines a soft backdrop to the tension in the air. Eli Rivers sat in seat 28E, his small frame curled slightly in the adult-sized chair, his hands still gripping his leather backpack. Every muscle in his body felt tight, a combination of fear, indignation, and the need to stay composed. Even in the face of Heather Lawson's authority, he tried to remember the lesson his father had drilled into him countless times. Strength isn't about shouting louder. It's about staying calm when the world tries to knock you down. Eli's thoughts wandered briefly to his home in Harlem, the warm glow of his bedroom lamp and the scent of his mother's favorite vanilla candle. He had prepared meticulously for this journey. His backpack contained his journal, a small pencil case, and a few science books. These were his constants, things that made him feel grounded even when everything else felt unstable. Across the aisle, George Whitman shifted in his seat. He had been watching the unfolding situation quietly, trying to reconcile the uneasy knot in his chest. For decades, he had prided himself on being a polite, observant passenger, never wanting to cause a scene. But now, confronted with a young boy being humiliated simply for his age and skin color, he felt a deep unease. He thought back to his own youth at Yale, the times he had witnessed injustice and chosen silence. That memory weighed on him, pressing against his conscience, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Meanwhile, Isabella Morales, the journalist seated beside Eli, opened her small notepad and began to scribble rapidly. Her instincts were firing on all cylinders. She had seen countless stories of bias, injustice, and quiet courage, but this one struck differently. The calm dignity of an 11-year-old boy, juxtaposed against the harsh authority of Heather Lawson, made her heart race. She felt the weight of a story that needed to be told, a story that could not be ignored. Naomi Fields, the young ground staffer who had verified Eli's boarding pass, glanced anxiously toward the aisle. She had been instructed to stay quiet, to follow protocol, but the flicker of doubt in Heather's eyes had unsettled her. Naomi remembered the times she had been overlooked or dismissed, times when adults had assumed her voice didn't matter. She knew the stakes now weren't just about a seat. They were about dignity. Her hands tightened around the scanner. If she spoke up now, perhaps she could tip the balance. Eli, oblivious to some of these dynamics, kept his gaze forward. He traced the edge of his journal, flipping to a blank page and writing a single line, "I belong here." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of preparation and self-belief. His mind flickered to his father, Malcolm Rivers, CEO of SkyTech Systems, who had taught him to recognize his own value even when others failed to see it. Malcolm had always been a towering figure in the business world, commanding rooms with quiet authority rather than noise, shaping outcomes with patience, intelligence, and integrity. Yet now, far away from Eli, he was racing through Manhattan traffic, heart pounding, intent on protecting his son. Heather Lawson, observing the boy quietly writing in his journal, felt a flicker of unease beneath her practiced composure. She told herself that she was following policy, that her actions were justified. But even as she straightened her shoulders and crossed her arms, there was a tiny, undeniable voice inside that whispered doubt. She glanced toward Jason Carter, the first officer, who nodded curtly, reinforcing the pretense of certainty. Yet she sensed a shift in the cabin, a tension that even the authority of her uniform could not entirely suppress. The hum of conversation among other passengers created a low, persistent background noise. Some leaned forward, murmuring to companions, "Why is the child being moved?" Others shook their heads, quietly judging the boy. Eli's eyes flicked to them, measuring reactions, cataloging faces and responses. Even in this uncomfortable moment, he maintained his posture, trying to emulate the strength he had witnessed in his father. Meanwhile, Malcolm Rivers was coordinating logistics from his office miles away. Using his VIP access, he was able to view live feeds from the cabin. The image of his son being led down the aisle, reluctant but composed, stirred a complex mix of anger and admiration in him. His mind raced through possible interventions. Negotiation was not enough. He needed immediate, undeniable action. The safety and dignity of Eli depended on timing and precision. Eli's gaze fell again to his journal. He wrote another line, the pencil moving with deliberate care. "Truth is louder than fear." That mantra had carried him through school challenges, boardroom simulations with his father, and now, the heightened tension of the airplane cabin. He felt the eyes of some passengers, the invisible weight of judgment, yet he refused to let it bend him. Isabella Morales clicked her phone on, subtly recording, while George Whitman shifted uncomfortably, torn between the lessons of his past and the urgency of the present. Naomi Fields, standing discreetly in the aisle, debated whether to intervene again. Each person's internal conflict contributed to a fragile ecosystem of tension that hung heavy in the air, pregnant with anticipation. Eli drew in a deep breath and whispered under his own voice, "Stay calm. Hold your ground." In that moment, the boy became a symbol, not just of himself, but of dignity challenged and tested. The audience of passengers, though varied in their attention and awareness, began to sense that something far larger than a simple seat dispute was unfolding. The first-class cabin, gleaming under the overhead lights, held its breath. Every detail, the polished silver, the neatly folded blankets, the hum of the engines, the subtle scent of coffee contrasted sharply with the tension, making Eli's small figure at once vulnerable and profoundly significant. Each observer, from the journalist to the silent businessman, from the young ground staffer to the passengers murmuring quietly, contributed to the pressure building toward an inevitable turning point. And miles away, Malcolm Rivers, focused entirely on the live feed of his son, prepared to act. Every second counted. The traffic, the logistics, the timing, it all had to converge perfectly. He knew the moment was coming when he would step onto the jet bridge, bringing with him authority, proof, and a quiet but undeniable power that would shift the entire cabin dynamic. In the meantime, Eli Rivers wrote one more line in his journal, a declaration that was both intimate and profound. I will not bow, not today, not ever. It was a promise, whispered into the air, almost unheard, yet it carried the weight of all the lessons from home, from his parents, and from a lifetime of learning that courage and dignity often come without applause. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, sensing the unfolding drama. Some whispered to one another. The cabin seemed suspended in time, each breath measured, each glance charged with the anticipation of something extraordinary. Eli's small fingers traced the edges of his backpack, steadying himself, while in the distance, Malcolm Rivers' SUV maneuvered through Manhattan, racing against the clock, every heartbeat syncing with the tension in the cabin. In that quiet, electric moment, the stage was set, the players were in place, the stakes unmistakable, and the world of first-class privilege and authority teetered on the brink of confrontation. And for Eli Rivers, 11 years old, sitting in an oversized seat, the lesson was already clear. Strength is not in shouting louder, but in holding firm when the world tries to erase your place. Eli Rivers shifted uncomfortably in seat 28E, the hard plastic of the adult-sized chair pressing against his knees. He tried to breathe evenly, inhaling the faint aroma of coffee and sanitized cabin air, reminding himself of his father's words. Strength comes from calm, even when everything around you is chaos. But chaos was all around him. Heather Lawson's sharp eyes never left him, and Jason Carter stood rigid in the aisle, radiating an authority that demanded compliance yet lacked understanding. Move him to the back. Now, Jason repeated, voice firm, betraying no hint of doubt. Eli's small hands gripped his leather backpack tighter. He glanced sideways at Naomi Fields, who shifted uneasily, the scanner still in her hand. Her face reflected both concern and hesitation. She wanted to intervene but was bound by protocol, yet inside. A quiet defiance flickered. She could see Eli's calm dignity, his courage in the face of unjust authority. Isabella Morales, pen poised above her notepad, whispered softly to Eli, "You're doing the right thing. Don't let them shake you." Her words were barely audible, yet they anchored him. For a fleeting moment, Eli felt less alone. Across the aisle, George Whitman adjusted in his seat again. He had witnessed enough in life to know when he should have spoken and when he remained silent. The image of Eli, a boy not yet 12, being commanded to abandon his rightful seat, tore at his conscience. Memories of inaction, of remaining quiet when others were mocked or dismissed, pressed heavily against him. He clenched his fists in his lap, the weight of decades of silence settling like a stone. Heather Lawson, meanwhile, leaned slightly closer to Eli, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Policy is policy. You don't belong here," she said sharply, her tone carrying across the first-class cabin. "Unaccompanied minors are for economy." Eli's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "My dad confirmed with the VIP desk. I'm allowed here," he said, his voice small but unwavering, the clarity of truth shining through. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the act of standing firm against the tide of authority. Heather's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to nod curtly. "We'll see about that," she murmured, stepping back to confer briefly with Jason Carter. Her shoulders were rigid, but beneath the surface, doubt had begun to creep in. The boy was calm, too composed. It didn't fit her expectations, and that unsettled her more than any protocol could. Eli shifted in his seat, opening his journal. With deliberate strokes, he began to write, "I will not bow. This is my seat. I belong here." Each word was a quiet declaration, a defiance in ink that neither Heather nor Jason could erase. It was more than a personal affirmation. It was the embodiment of every lesson his father had ever taught him about dignity, truth, and courage. The cabin seemed to pulse with tension. Passengers whispered in low tones, some confused, some sympathetic. A woman in row 5 shook her head, muttering to her companion, "Why is this child being punished?" Others, less empathetic, crossed their arms, observing silently, as if the boy's presence alone could disrupt their own sense of order. Naomi Fields shifted again, scanning the boarding pass on her device. Her eyes darted to Heather Lawson and back to Eli. She wanted to intervene more forcefully, but fear of reprimand held her back. Still, she stood close, a quiet protector. Her moral compass in quiet alignment with the boy she had just verified. Isabella Morales clicked her phone on discreetly, beginning to capture footage of the unfolding incident. She was careful, mindful of privacy and propriety, but instinctively knew that this moment needed documentation. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she framed the shot, capturing Eli's calm defiance and the rigid, almost mechanical movements of Heather Lawson and Jason Carter. George Whitman sighed audibly, finally unable to contain the conflict within him. "This isn't right," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. His gaze fell on Eli, who had just lifted his pen from the journal, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, determination, and an understanding that this battle, though small in scale, represented something far larger. Eli's mind drifted for a moment to his father, Malcolm Rivers, in his office miles away. He imagined his father's steady hands, the quiet authority that demanded respect without shouting, the calm resolve that could move mountains. "He's coming," Eli thought, feeling a flicker of hope spark within him. "He'll make this right." Heather Lawson, sensing a slight shift in the cabin's energy, tapped her headset nervously. The murmurs of passengers, the subtle glances, and the calm insistence of Eli's posture created an internal friction that she hadn't anticipated. Her authority, though absolute in her own mind, was being quietly undermined. The boy was unshakable. Jason Carter, standing beside her, clenched his jaw. He wanted to assert control to maintain the illusion of authority, but even he could feel the unease spreading through the cabin. The sight of a young boy, calm and composed under scrutiny, was unsettling in a way that no training or protocol could prepare him for. Eli's fingers traced the edge of his backpack. His pulse was steady despite the humiliation he had endured. Every step down the aisle, every whisper from Heather and Jason had tested his resolve. But he held fast. He scribbled another line in his journal. "Truth is louder than fear." The cabin's atmosphere thickened. Passengers leaned forward slightly, some whispering, others observing silently. Isabella Morales adjusted her phone discreetly, capturing every subtle expression, every twitch of discomfort, every moment of quiet defiance from Eli. The tension between authority and integrity, between prejudice and truth, was palpable, stretching the minutes into an eternity. Naomi Fields glanced at Eli, offering a faint nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to Eli, it felt like a lifeline. He inhaled deeply, the metallic scent of the cabin and the faint aroma of coffee grounding him. He felt the weight of the moment, but also the strength within himself that his father had nurtured. And miles away, Malcolm Rivers's SUV moved steadily through Manhattan traffic. His eyes were fixed on his phone, reviewing the live feed from the cabin. Every movement, every hesitation, every micro-expression was analyzed in real time. The clock was ticking. 15 minutes, he calculated. In 15 minutes, he would be on that jet bridge. In 15 minutes. The injustice that had already caused so much emotional turmoil would meet the unyielding force of truth and authority. Eli Rivers wrote one final line in his journal. For the moment, I will not be erased. The words resonated with power, quiet yet unmistakable. He looked around the cabin once more, his gaze settling on the passengers who had been watching silently. Somewhere, he thought, someone would see. Somewhere, someone would act. The cabin held its collective breath, poised between inaction and the approaching storm. Eli Rivers, 11 years old, seated in an oversized chair, had already begun to teach everyone around him a lesson in courage, dignity, and the quiet power of standing firm. Eli Rivers sat quietly in seat 28E, the oversized chair making his knees ache. Yet he refused to shift. Every nerve in his body buzzed with tension, the weight of unjust authority pressing down as if the cabin itself had conspired against him. His journal lay open on his lap, the pencil poised above the blank page. He wanted to write, to channel his emotions, yet words seemed inadequate. How could he capture the sting of being told he didn't belong where he had every right to be? He glanced at Heather Lawson. The lead flight attendant's posture was rigid, eyes sharp, but Eli could detect a flicker of hesitation beneath her mask of authority. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it existed. Eli's mind raced. He remembered every lesson his father, Malcolm Rivers, had taught him about patience, composure, and standing firm in the face of injustice. Courage isn't loud, it's quiet and unwavering, Malcolm had said. Eli drew in a slow breath and whispered under it, I will not be erased. Across the aisle. George Whitman shifted uncomfortably. His palms were clammy, and his old bones felt heavier than usual, burdened by decades of inaction. He remembered countless moments when he had remained silent while witnessing injustice, turning his head, avoiding responsibility. Now, staring at Eli's composed defiance, he felt a deep pang of guilt. This is one of those moments, he thought. I can't stay silent anymore. But his voice caught in his throat. Fear and hesitation held him back, even as the moral imperative tugged at his conscience. Isabella Morales crouched slightly in her seat, notepad in hand. She had been scribbling notes feverishly, capturing every detail. Her fingers hovered over the phone, recording quietly. She was the chronicler of the unfolding injustice, but her own mind raced. How many times had she witnessed bias go unchallenged, people's voices silenced by authority? The difference here was Eli so young, so calm, so dignified. His courage demanded attention, and yet she hesitated, wondering if simply documenting was enough. Naomi Fields stood near the aisle, scanning the boarding pass once more, Her scanner was warm in her hands, a small comfort. She wanted to step forward, to speak loudly, to confront Heather Lawson and Jason Carter, but the invisible rules of protocol restrained her. Every fiber in her body urged her to act, yet fear of reprisal restrained her movements. The internal struggle was almost unbearable. She caught Eli's gaze briefly, and a small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. It was enough to communicate solidarity, a shared understanding of the stakes. Eli's pencil moved finely, scratching across the page. They cannot take my truth. They cannot silence me. Writing these words helped him focus, channeling his anger, shame, and resolve into something tangible. He felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, replaced by a quiet fire. It was not rebellion in the loud sense, it was a steadfast claim of his rights, a refusal to let the moment define him negatively. Heather Lawson, watching the boy write, felt her own composure waver. She reminded herself that she was following protocol, that unaccompanied minors were not allowed in first class. Yet the calm defiance emanating from Eli unsettled her. The whispers of the passengers and the tension in the cabin gnawed at the certainty she had relied upon. Doubt was a dangerous intruder in a mind accustomed to unquestioned authority. Jason Carter, standing rigidly beside her, glanced at Eli and felt a flicker of unease himself. His training told him to enforce rules, to maintain order, yet the sight of a boy, composed and articulate, being humiliated for no reason beyond arbitrary policy, gnawed at the edges of his conscience. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, an unconscious sign of inner conflict. George Whitman exhaled slowly. He wanted to speak, to defend the boy, yet the words tangled in his throat. The years of social conditioning and polite restraint clashed violently with the urgency he now felt. Watching Eli, he realized that silence would mean complicity, and the weight of that realization made his chest ache. Eli's eyes wandered briefly across the cabin. The murmurs, the quiet stares, the subtle shifts in posture, all of it told him that people were noticing, that the moment held significance beyond his own predicament. He wrote another line in his journal: "My presence matters, my voice matters, I matter." The words were simple, yet profound. They anchored him, and in them he found courage. Naomi Fields took a cautious step forward, scanning the room, sensing the subtle shifts in atmosphere. The tension had become almost tangible, a living thing that hovered over every passenger and crew member. She felt the moral weight pressing down, yet also the faint spark of hope that justice might prevail. Isabella Morales whispered to herself, capturing every detail. This is more than a child's seat. This is dignity under attack. Her words were for no one in particular, but Eli caught them in the corner of his ear and drew strength. He could feel the network of silent allies forming around him, their courage small but real. Eli closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the cabin air, tasting the metallic hint of the pressurized environment, and steadied himself. Every second stretched long. Every heartbeat marked a rhythm of tension and anticipation. Somewhere beyond the jet bridge, Malcolm Rivers was moving, racing against the clock, and Eli knew that help was coming, but for now, he had to endure, and endure with poise. He opened his journal again and wrote a final thought for the moment. Courage is not absence of fear. Courage is standing when you are afraid. The words felt alive on the page, a silent anthem of resistance and integrity. In that cramped, economy-adjacent seat, Eli Rivers embodied the lesson his father had spent years teaching. Dignity is non-negotiable, and truth cannot be silenced. The cabin's energy shifted subtly. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering, some frowning. Heather Lawson's posture became even more rigid, aware, subconsciously, that the tide of moral judgment in the room was turning. Jason Carter's jaw tightened. Even the soft hum of the engine seemed to underscore the tension, a reminder that the minutes were slipping by toward a reckoning. Eli Rivers remained seated, poised, journal open, heart steady. In that moment, the battle was not yet over, but the foundation had been laid. Courage had taken root, quiet yet unbreakable. The stage was set for what was coming next, and every player, passenger, crew, and observer felt the undercurrent of a moment that would soon demand resolution. Eli Rivers' fingers trembled slightly as he held his phone, the small device feeling heavier than usual. His breath came in measured bursts, a rhythm to calm his nerves, to steady the rising tide of anxiety. "Dad, it's happening," he whispered, almost inaudibly, hoping the flight attendants wouldn't hear. The words carried both fear and determination, the quiet assertion that he would not submit silently to injustice. Across Manhattan. Malcolm Rivers felt the vibration of his phone on the polished glass table. He snatched it up, his eyes instantly locking on the caller ID. Eli. The urgency in his son's voice was unmistakable, igniting a flame of concern that cut through the calm facade of corporate strategy and billion-dollar negotiations. Malcolm's mind raced, calculating logistics, timing, and access. 15 minutes, he thought. 15 minutes to reach the gate. 15 minutes to confront injustice before it escalated further. "Dad, they're forcing me out of my seat. They say I can't be in first class. Heather Lawson, Jason Carter. They don't believe me." Eli continued, his small voice carrying a quiet defiance. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Memories surged unbidden years of being underestimated. Doors slammed shut because of his skin. The countless boardrooms where respect had to be earned a dozen times over. But this was different. This was his son, and the rules of business did not apply here. "Eli, stay calm." "I'm coming," Malcolm replied firmly, his voice steadied despite the pounding of adrenaline in his veins. Back in the cabin, Heather Lawson observed Eli's composure, noting the subtle courage in his posture, his small hands clutching the journal, eyes steady, not pleading, not breaking. It was unsettling. Authority was supposed to command fear and submission. Instead, Eli projected confidence and dignity. She adjusted her uniform collar, masking the flicker of doubt, but it lingered in the corners of her mind. Jason Carter shifted, uneasy. He had always relied on procedure to justify actions, but seeing Eli's quiet strength exposed the limitations of blind adherence. He glanced at Heather, searching for reassurance, but her expression was taut, almost defensive. The passengers' whispers began to rise, a low murmur that threaded through the cabin, hinting at dissatisfaction and subtle rebellion. Isabella Morales, seated in 1C, had her phone ready, discreetly filming. Every glance, every twitch of tension, every flicker of authority and defiance was being captured. She whispered softly, mostly to herself, "This is more than a story. It's a testament to dignity under fire." Eli caught her words and felt a surge of reassurance. He was not alone. Witnesses were watching, recording, feeling the weight of the moment. George Whitman, across the aisle, sighed heavily. He had spent decades staying quiet in the face of discomfort, But now the boy in front of him radiated a courage that demanded recognition. His hands tightened on the armrests. Not this time, he thought. I will not remain silent. But fear and habit held his voice captive. The internal struggle mirrored the tension in the cabin, a silent battle between conscience and conformity. Naomi Fields shifted her weight, finally gathering the courage to speak internally, questioning protocol. Every fiber in her body urged intervention. She glanced at Eli's calm yet tense posture, the small journal open, the pencil hovering. The boy was asserting his right to belong. Naomi's conscience demanded action, even if just as moral support. Eli's thoughts returned to the upcoming confrontation. He remembered Malcolm's lessons about integrity and self-respect. Truth is stronger than authority when wielded correctly, he thought, tracing a line across the page in his journal. Every stroke of the pencil was a small act of resistance, a declaration that his presence mattered, that injustice would not pass unnoticed. Meanwhile, Malcolm Rivers maneuvered his sleek black SUV through Manhattan traffic. The skyline blurred past as he monitored his ETA, coordinating with the VIP desk to ensure immediate access to the gate. He thought of Heather Lawson, Jason Carter, and the quiet defiance of Eli, his corporate instincts honed over decades of negotiations, calculated leverage, timing, and optics. This confrontation required precision, but more than that, it required proof, authority, and presence. In the cabin, Eli looked around once more. The hum of the engines, the soft rustle of blankets, the glint of polished silver, these mundane details contrasted sharply with the moral storm brewing. He whispered under his breath, "I am not afraid. I belong here." The words were quiet but resolute, a mantra that anchored him. His eyes flicked to Isabella, who nodded subtly, documenting silently. The network of quiet allies, each with their own hesitations and fears, provided a fragile support system, a web of moral reinforcement that strengthened Eli's resolve. Heather Lawson, sensing the subtle shift in the cabin, felt authority slipping, the murmurs of passengers, the boy's unwavering gaze. The small acts of quiet defiance, it all began to unravel the certainty she had relied upon. Her hands tightened into fists, almost imperceptibly, yet the tremor betrayed her. Jason Carter noticed. His own unease mirrored in the slight stiffness of his posture. The facade of control was fraying. Eli Rivers took another deep breath, opening his journal once more. He wrote with deliberate calm. Courage is quiet, but unstoppable. The words reflected the lesson instilled in him by his father, that true strength is measured not by force or anger, but by the unwavering commitment to one's dignity. Outside, Malcolm Rivers arrived at the gate. His presence, authority, and purpose combined to form a silent promise he would protect his son and confront the injustice in the cabin. Security personnel stepped aside as Malcolm's badge granted immediate access. Each second, each step down the jet bridge, synchronized with the tension inside the aircraft. The moment of confrontation was imminent. The passengers sensed it. A subtle stir passed through the cabin. Isabella Morales adjusted her camera discreetly, capturing the approach. George Whitman straightened, the weight of guilt and recognition aligning. Naomi Fields shifted, preparing to witness what she hoped would be the restoration of dignity. Eli's heart beat in anticipation, not fear. He knew his father was coming, and the moment of reckoning was near. And somewhere in the cabin, a new figure appeared, Lila Chen, The replacement flight attendant, quietly observing, prepared to assist Eli once the confrontation concluded. Her presence, subtle yet significant, signaled a shift toward fairness, respect, and restoration. Eli Rivers clutched his journal, whispering softly, "Hold on. Dad, I'm ready." The stage was set, the players were in place, the quiet storm of injustice, courage, and authority was about to collide, and the first-class cabin held its collective breath. The jet bridge was unusually quiet, the hum of distant conversations and rolling luggage fading as Malcolm Rivers stepped forward. His black leather shoes clicked deliberately against the polished floor, each sound a measured beat of authority. The badge around his neck caught the light, signaling that he was not just another passenger, but a CEO with leverage, influence, and the sharp intellect to match. Eli Rivers's small hands tightened on his journal as he watched the figure approaching. Relief mixed with anticipation. The boy's heart beating steadily despite the anxiety that had been building for the past several minutes. He had held his ground, written his truths, and now his father had arrived to assert what had long been his right dignity, fairness, and respect. Heather Lawson's eyes narrowed as she recognized the man. The authority in Malcolm's posture, the controlled intensity in his gaze, contrasted sharply with the panic that had begun to creep into her demeanor. Jason Carter stiffened beside her, realizing that the dynamics of the cabin had shifted irrevocably. The balance of power had tilted, and the veneer of absolute control they had wielded over Eli was crumbling. Malcolm's voice cut through the cabin, calm yet commanding. "Heather Lawson, Jason Carter, I need to speak with my son immediately." His words were deliberate, unhurried, yet impossible to ignore. The passengers shifted, their curiosity piqued, sensing the shift in tension. Whispers spread softly across rows, the murmur of anticipation thickening the air. Eli felt a surge of strength in his chest. His father's presence was not just reassurance, it was validation. Every lesson Malcolm had instilled the principles of calm authority, resilience, and unwavering dignity manifested in this moment. Eli straightened in his seat, gripping his journal tightly, eyes fixed on Heather, who now seemed uncertain, defensive, and visibly uncomfortable. Heather Lawson attempted to maintain her composure. "Sir, protocol is clear. Unaccompanied minors are not allowed in first class," she said, her tone tight, betraying the conflict within. She gestured toward Jason Carter, seeking silent support. He shifted uneasily, aware that this confrontation was far beyond the usual enforcement of rules. Malcolm Rivers' gaze swept the cabin, landing on every witness George Whitman, whose conscience had been stirred, Isabella Morales, whose phone subtly recorded the moment, Naomi Fields, who stood silently near Eli, and Lila Chen, poised and ready to act when the situation allowed. His eyes finally settled on Heather Lawson. "Protocol does not justify discrimination," he said evenly, the words weighted with both truth and authority. "My son has a verified boarding pass, confirmed by your own staff. There is no ambiguity here." Eli whispered softly, "Dad," his voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of relief and trust. Heather Lawson swallowed hard, the tension in her shoulders betraying the unease she had been fighting to suppress. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that the moment had escalated beyond policy into the realm of moral reckoning. Isabella Morales's fingers hovered over her camera, capturing every flicker of doubt, every micro-expression, every subtle change in the cabin's atmosphere. She could feel history being documented in real time. George Whitman exhaled slowly, a sense of accountability finally settling in. Naomi Fields felt a quiet surge of empowerment, knowing that truth was finally being championed. Malcolm stepped closer to Eli, lowering his voice just enough to be heard. "You held your ground," he said softly. "I'm proud of you. Never forget that standing tall is your right, and sometimes your duty." Eli nodded, the words sinking in, reinforcing the quiet courage he had maintained through the ordeal. Heather Lawson's eyes darted around the cabin, noting the murmurs of disapproval, the subtle gestures of support toward Eli. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her uniform, realizing that the facade of unquestioned authority was slipping. Jason Carter's jaw tightened, the weight of recognition settling in that he had acted unjustly. Malcolm's voice rang out again, this time projected into the entire cabin. "This situation ends now. The child returns to the seat he purchased, as verified by your staff, without further delay. Any attempt to deny this is not just a breach of protocol, it is discrimination." Lila Chen stepped forward quietly, her presence a signal of support. She moved toward Eli's original seat in first class, ensuring that when the moment came, the boy's return would be seamless and dignified. The passengers watched, some with muted applause, others leaning in, sensing that they were witnessing a restoration of fairness and justice in real time. Heather Lawson's composure cracked. I was following training," she stammered, the words weak and unconvincing under Malcolm's unwavering gaze. "Training does not tell you to humiliate a child or ignore verified passes," Malcolm replied calmly, yet with an edge of undeniable authority. His presence, his logic, his moral clarity made her arguments irrelevant. Eli felt the tension lift slightly as his father positioned himself beside him. The quiet power of Malcolm's presence radiated through the cabin, a counterbalance to the unjust authority that had attempted to define Eli's experience. The first passengers began to murmur their support, some nodding, others recording discreetly, reinforcing the legitimacy of the moment. Isabella Morales whispered softly to herself, capturing every detail. "This is dignity in action, courage recognized, injustice confronted." George Whitman nodded slightly, as though finally absolving himself from the weight of decades of silence. Naomi Fields felt her chest expand with quiet relief, knowing she had witnessed a moment that would set a precedent, one that could ripple far beyond this flight. Eli Rivers, 11 years old, journal clutched tightly, felt a profound sense of resolution. He had endured, held firm, and now, with his father by his side, the restoration of fairness and dignity was imminent. Every lesson, every whispered mantra, every deliberate act of calm courage had culminated in this defining moment. The cabin held its collective breath as Malcolm Rivers stepped closer to Eli's original seat in first class. Every step he took radiated authority, not arrogance, but calm and precise command. Heather Lawson's hands shook slightly as she adjusted the cuffs of her uniform. The carefully constructed walls of confidence she had relied on for years beginning to crumble. Jason Carter remained rigid, but even he sensed that the tide had shifted irreversibly. Eli's small hand gripped the edge of his backpack. He had waited, endured, and held his ground for what felt like an eternity. His eyes flicked toward Lila Chen, who nodded subtly, signaling readiness to restore his rightful place. The anticipation hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint hum of the engines and the whispers of passengers. "Sir," Heather Lawson began, her voice tight and strained. "We were following protocol." Malcolm's gaze swept the cabin, silencing her instantly. "Protocol is not an excuse for bias. Verified passes, confirmation from staff, respect for passengers, these are not negotiable. Sit your child in the seat he purchased." Eli felt a quiet surge of relief. He rose carefully, backpack in tow, and walked toward seat 1B, each step deliberate, composed, and dignified. Every passenger in the cabin seemed to hold their breath. George Whitman's eyes glistened slightly as he shifted forward, a subtle nod acknowledging Eli's courage. Isabella Morales whispered softly, almost to herself, "This is history in motion." Naomi Fields stepped aside, allowing Lila Chen to guide Eli smoothly back to his rightful seat. The air seemed to shift as he settled in, the leather seat enveloping him comfortably, a stark contrast to the tension and humiliation he'd endured minutes before. The passengers' whispers began to grow, a swell of acknowledgement and support for the boy who had refused to bow. Heather Lawson's jaw tightened. Her years of experience had never prepared her for this, a child's quiet dignity, exposing the inadequacy of rigid adherence to protocol in the face of injustice. She attempted to reassert authority, but her voice faltered. Jason Carter looked at her, realizing that they were powerless against truth and calm resolve. The murmurs of the cabin, the eyes of the passengers, the presence of Malcolm Rivers all rendered their resistance futile. Malcolm Rivers knelt slightly beside Eli, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You held your ground beautifully," he whispered. "Never forget, courage is not absence of fear, but standing tall despite it." Eli nodded, absorbing the quiet strength of his father's words, feeling both relief and pride coursing through him. The passengers began to murmur more audibly now. A woman in row 7 leaned forward, whispering, "That little boy did nothing wrong. He showed his pass, and they ignored it." Others began to nod, whispering among themselves, the collective recognition of injustice spreading like a wave. George Whitman, moved by decades of restrained silence, finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "He is right. I saw it too, and I regret staying silent before." Isabella Morales adjusted her phone subtly, capturing the reactions, the restored seat, the authority of Malcolm Rivers, and the visible discomposure of Heather Lawson and Jason Carter. She whispered softly, "This is what truth looks like when it's acted upon." Heather Lawson's face flushed with the realization that her actions had been witnessed, judged, and deemed wrong. Her hands trembled as she spoke, almost pleading. I didn't mean Malcolm Rivers' calm yet commanding tone cut through her hesitancy. "Intent does not excuse impact. Your actions humiliated a child. That is not negotiable." Jason Carter's jaw clenched. He had relied on procedure to shield himself, but the clarity of Malcolm's words left no room for justification. The cabin's attention pressed down, and he felt the weight of accountability for the first time in his career. Lila Chen moved with gentle efficiency, ensuring Eli was fully settled. She offered a small smile and said quietly, "You're safe now, sir." Eli's lips curved into a tentative smile, the first genuine expression since the ordeal began. Relief, pride, and empowerment mingled in his small frame, radiating subtly through the cabin. Malcolm Rivers stood tall again, projecting authority and moral clarity to the passengers. "This is more than a seat. he said evenly, voice carrying clearly. "This is about respect, fairness, and dignity. No child, no passenger should ever be made to feel that they do not belong because of prejudice." A ripple of acknowledgement spread through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering affirmations, others recording discreetly. Isabella Morales captured every moment, knowing that this sequence of events would resonate far beyond this single flight. George Whitman's hands relaxed on the armrests, a sense of personal redemption passing through him. Naomi Fields exhaled, feeling the relief of justice restored. Heather Lawson finally looked down, lips pressed tightly. She muttered, almost to herself, "Protocol, training," but the words sounded hollow. Malcolm Rivers' gaze never wavered, firm and unyielding, silently communicating that authority misused is not a shield against truth. Eli Rivers, now safely in seat 1B, opened his journal and wrote deliberately, "Courage stands when fear whispers. Truth will be seen. I belong." The words captured not only his personal journey but the quiet defiance and integrity he had maintained throughout the ordeal. Malcolm Rivers glanced at the cabin, noting the shift in energy. The tension that had pervaded every row, every passenger, every crew member, was dissipating. The balance had been restored. Justice, though delayed, had been enacted. The murmurs of support, the small nods, the visible acknowledgement of wrongdoing, all testified to the power of courage paired with authority wielded rightly. Lila Chen offered Eli a reassuring smile. "It's okay now. You're back where you belong." Eli nodded, the faintest hint of a proud smile on his face. He felt seen, validated, and empowered, his dignity intact, his spirit unbroken. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. The realization of their failure hung heavy in the air. They had exercised authority without integrity, relied on bias rather than fairness, and the consequences were visible not just in the boys' restored seat, but in the eyes of every witness around them. Malcolm Rivers leaned slightly toward Eli, his voice low but firm. "This is just the beginning. Stand tall. Always, witnesses matter, courage matters, and truth matters." Eli nodded, absorbing every word, feeling a profound sense of purpose and empowerment settle over him. The cabin exhaled collectively. The engines hummed steadily, yet the energy was charged with a sense of justice realized, fairness restored, and the unmistakable power of integrity upheld. Every passenger who had doubted, hesitated, or observed silently had been given a lesson in courage, dignity, and accountability. The cabin, once taut with tension, began to settle into a quieter rhythm. Eli Rivers remained seated in 1B, hands folded on his small journal. Yet the energy around him vibrated with the resonance of what had just occurred. Every passenger seemed to exhale collectively, releasing the suffocating weight of injustice that had lingered moments before. Heather Lawson stood rigid, glancing around the cabin, her face pale, eyes darting nervously as she struggled to reclaim some sense of authority. The murmurs from passengers grew louder, but instead of compliance, they carried a hint of judgment, subtle but unmistakable. She swallowed hard, realizing that the illusion of unquestioned control had been shattered. Jason Carter remained stiff, jaw tight, his usual confidence undermined by the quiet force of truth surrounding him. Malcolm Rivers adjusted his jacket, standing tall beside Eli, projecting calm strength. He addressed the cabin, his voice steady yet carrying weight. "The situation has been resolved. My son is in his rightful seat, confirmed and verified. Any further attempts to undermine this are unacceptable. Respect is non-negotiable." Passengers began to respond, some whispering support, others nodding in acknowledgement. A woman in row 9 leaned toward her companion, murmuring, "Finally, that child had every right." A young man near the back, who had been watching silently, exhaled audibly and muttered, "It shouldn't have taken this long, but at least it's right now." The cabin was alive with a subtle, collective affirmation of fairness restored. Isabella Morales, keeping her phone discreetly recording, captured every nuanced expression, the shift in energy, and the quiet aftermath of confrontation. Her thoughts flowed rapidly. Framing the narrative, this was not only a story of a child's courage, but a lesson in accountability, integrity, and the power of witnesses in shaping outcomes. Eli Rivers opened his journal slowly, writing in deliberate strokes, "Dignity stands when injustice falls. I am seen. I am heard." The words were both a personal affirmation and a quiet testament to the collective support that had emerged from the tension-filled cabin. Heather Lawson's hands shook as she adjusted her uniform again. The reality of her actions, now visible to all, weighed heavily. Jason Carter glanced at her, their shared silence thick with recognition of their failures. The murmurs of the passengers, the subtle nods, and the recording devices capturing everything made it clear that the accountability extended beyond personal embarrassment. It would follow them beyond this flight. Lila Chen moved subtly, checking on Eli once more, offering a gentle smile. "Everything is okay now," she whispered. Her presence, quiet yet significant, provided both comfort and reinforcement of the restored order. Eli's small smile reflected trust, relief, and the lingering pride of having endured and emerged with dignity intact. George Whitman, who had been observing silently, shifted in his seat. The decades of internalized silence and inaction now contrasted sharply with the courage displayed by Eli and Malcolm. He cleared his throat and spoke softly but firmly. This is how it should have been. I'm sorry I did not recognize it sooner." His words carried weight, a subtle acknowledgement of moral responsibility, a small act of personal reckoning. Naomi Fields exhaled, feeling a wave of relief. She had observed protocol and hierarchy, questioned actions internally, and finally witnessed justice restored. The quiet tension in her chest eased, replaced by a sense of affirmation that truth and courage had prevailed. Malcolm Rivers glanced at Eli, a soft smile crossing his face. "You held your ground well. Your strength is what made this possible," he said quietly. Eli nodded, understanding that the ordeal had been both a test and a lesson in resilience. Every whisper, every recording, every supportive glance from passengers reinforced that courage, even when quiet, could not be ignored. The cabin's atmosphere shifted further as murmurs turned into subtle applause. Some passengers began to clap softly, a recognition not only of Eli's courage, but of the broader lesson unfolding in real-time dignity is an inalienable right, and standing up against prejudice matters, Isabella Morales whispered to herself, capturing the moment. This is more than a story. It's a movement in miniature, a lesson for all who witness it. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter exchanged a final, strained glance. The reality of accountability had settled fully. Their years of experience, the authority they wielded, and the rigid structures they relied upon were no match for calm courage backed by truth and witness. They realized that this moment would define them, for better or worse, and there was no escaping the lessons imposed by the collective attention of the cabin. Malcolm Rivers looked around once more, ensuring Eli felt supported and safe. The murmurs, whispers, and subtle gestures of acknowledgement from the passengers reflected a new dynamic in the cabin. Justice had been restored, and the moral compass of the space realigned. Eli Rivers, journal in hand, glanced at each passenger. His eyes lingered on George Whitman, who offered a tentative nod, on Isabella Morales, who subtly captured the significance of the moment, on Naomi Fields, whose quiet presence had been a moral anchor, and finally on Leela Chen, whose calm efficiency ensured dignity had been maintained. In that network of acknowledgement, Eli recognized that courage and truth, when supported even subtly, could shift the balance of power. The engines hummed steadily, the ambient noise of the cabin resuming its rhythm, but the energy remained charged with the residue of confrontation, courage, and moral reckoning. Passengers leaned back, some exchanging quiet smiles, some nodding to one another, a shared recognition that they had witnessed something important, something that transcended the usual monotony of air travel. Malcolm Rivers placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. This is only the beginning. Never forget that standing for what is right requires patience, courage, and clarity. Today, you've shown all three. Eli's small smile widened slightly. The ordeal had been intense, but it had instilled a deeper understanding of dignity, resilience, and moral courage. The cabin, now quieter, felt lighter, infused with a subtle sense of justice and awareness. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter were no longer authoritative figures. They were witnesses, marked by the recognition of their failings and the undeniable power of truth and courage. The passengers' reactions, soft applause, murmurs, and nods reinforced that accountability, when acted upon, has ripple effects far beyond the immediate moment. The cabin had settled into a rhythm, yet the echoes of tension lingered like an invisible pulse. Eli Rivers, sitting upright in seat 1B, flipped open his journal once more. His small fingers traced the edges of his previous entries, the words of courage and resilience reminding him of the ordeal he had endured. His eyes swept the cabin, observing the passengers' subtle reactions, quiet nods, whispered acknowledgments, and the occasional glance toward his father, Malcolm Rivers, whose presence radiated calm authority. Malcolm Rivers stood near Eli, quietly surveying the room. He understood that restoring Eli's seat was only the beginning. The incident had revealed systemic weaknesses, flaws in training, protocol, and moral judgment that could no longer be ignored. He made mental notes, already formulating a plan to implement change. His mind was precise, balancing urgency with strategy, knowing that every action taken now would ripple far beyond this single flight. Heather Lawson sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of realization pressing down. She had been forced to confront her bias and poor judgment, and the public exposure, though limited to the cabin, was a moral reckoning she could not avoid. Jason Carter, beside her, shared the same tension. Their authority had been undermined, their credibility shaken, and the judgment of every witness in the room compounded the personal and professional consequences they now faced. Eli glanced at Isabella Morales, who had been documenting the incident with a keen eye. Her camera captured not just the confrontation, but the subtle aftermath, the shifting energy. the quiet justice being restored, and the passengers' reactions. She whispered softly, "This will be seen by thousands. People need to understand what courage looks like." Eli nodded slightly, absorbing the acknowledgement that his story and the dignity he maintained was being recorded and amplified beyond the cabin. George Whitman shifted in his seat, his expression thoughtful. The events unfolding had forced him to confront years of inaction. The murmurs of support from other passengers validated the courage he had failed to express in past situations. He felt a flicker of hope that witnessing accountability, even in a small way, could inspire others to act differently in the future. Naomi Fields, standing near the aisle, took a deep breath. She had been anxious about the repercussions of challenging authority, but watching Malcolm Rivers handle the situation with calm decisiveness reassured her. She realized that courage and integrity often require observation, patience, and the right moment to act. Her own resolve strengthened, and she silently vowed to carry these lessons into her future actions. Lila Chen moved quietly between the rows, checking on passengers and ensuring Eli remained comfortable. Her demeanor was gentle yet efficient, a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated the cabin minutes before. She provided the subtle reassurance Eli needed, signaling that fairness and respect were not abstract ideals. They were actions being implemented in real time. Malcolm Rivers, sensing the moment to transition from confrontation to proactive change, addressed the cabin once more. "Today's events have highlighted more than a single error," he said evenly, voice carrying authority without aggression. "They have revealed the gaps in training, judgment, and protocol that allow bias to go unchecked. This is not just about a seat. It is about ensuring that every passenger, every child, every individual is treated with dignity and respect." The passengers leaned forward slightly, whispers rippling through the cabin. The energy was no longer tense with conflict, but charged with recognition and anticipation. Isabella Morales's camera continued to record, capturing faces, nods, and small gestures of agreement. The moral clarity in Malcolm's voice resonated, creating a subtle but palpable sense of collective validation. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter exchanged a tense glance. Their faces reflected the awareness that their actions had been scrutinized, judged, and corrected. The quiet authority of Malcolm Rivers had shifted the balance, and they were left to grapple with the consequences. It was a moment of reckoning that would extend beyond this flight, reshaping how they approached protocol, judgment, and personal bias in the future. Malcolm turned toward Eli, kneeling slightly to meet his son's gaze. "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steadfast, and unyielding," he said softly. "You have shown all three. Now, we ensure that this experience changes more than just today, it changes the system." Eli nodded, a quiet smile forming. His hands, previously tense on the journal, relaxed. He understood that his role had shifted from participant to catalyst, and that even small actions could produce systemic change when guided by integrity and moral clarity. The murmurs of passengers transformed into small expressions of approval, a soft clap here, a nod there, a whispered affirmation that truth had prevailed. George Whitman, observing quietly, added his voice to the acknowledgement. "It's rare to witness justice unfold in real time," he murmured, "but today it has been restored." Naomi Fields exhaled, a sense of relief washing over her. The cabin was no longer a place of tension, but a stage for moral clarity and collective witness. Malcolm Rivers shifted his stance, projecting a sense of calm authority that resonated through every row. We will implement new training protocols, independent review boards, and real-time checks to ensure that no passenger is ever dismissed or humiliated based on bias again. He continued. The cabin absorbed the words, recognizing that action would follow talk. Lila Chen, moving silently among the passengers, ensured that the message of fairness and restoration was embodied in her actions. Reinforcing the moral shift that had taken place, Eli Rivers, journal open once more, wrote in deliberate strokes, "Truth and courage together create change. Witnesses matter, actions matter, and dignity cannot be taken away." Each word captured both the immediate triumph and the promise of systemic reform. Malcolm Rivers nodded slightly, acknowledging that Eli's resilience had catalyzed not just the restoration of a seat, but a broader commitment to justice and fairness. Isabella Morales whispered to herself, "Capture in the moment." This is more than a story of a child's bravery. It is a blueprint for accountability, integrity, and systemic change. George Whitman shifted again, a faint smile forming as he realized that observing courage could inspire courage in others. Naomi Fields, now composed and resolute, prepared to take these lessons forward in her own life. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed steadily, yet the atmosphere remained vibrant with the quiet energy of moral clarity. Eli Rivers leaned back, journal in lap, feeling the weight of the ordeal lifted and replaced with empowerment, purpose, and hope. Malcolm Rivers placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership between courage and action, of the lessons that would extend far beyond this flight. The cabin, now calm, seemed almost serene after the flurry of confrontation and resolution. Eli Rivers sat upright in seat 1B, his small hands resting on the open journal, eyes alert yet at ease. The subtle vibrations of the engines beneath the floor blended with the soft murmur of passengers returning to a sense of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, the air carried the lingering resonance of the events that had unfolded. Every glance, every gesture of acknowledgement, reinforced that a quiet revolution had taken place. Malcolm Rivers, standing near the aisle, addressed the passengers with measured authority. "We will ensure that today's events are not isolated," he said evenly, voice calm but firm. "Bias has no place in any airline, any institution, or any interaction. We will implement mandatory anti-bias training, independent review boards, and enhanced verification systems to protect every passenger's rights." His words rippled through the cabin, drawing subtle nods and murmurs of agreement. Heather Lawson sat rigidly, her hands resting tensely in her lap. The weight of the day's events pressed on her. She had witnessed authority confronted, bias exposed, and dignity restored. And now she understood that professional competence must be inseparable from moral clarity. Jason Carter, beside her, avoided direct eye contact with Malcolm, his posture rigid, the lessons of accountability settling heavily in his chest. Eli Rivers glanced up at his father. Malcolm's presence, calm yet commanding, was a steady reminder that courage paired with strategy could reshape even entrenched systems. Eli nodded slightly, feeling the quiet empowerment that came from witnessing both personal and systemic restoration. He had endured humiliation, held his dignity intact, and now saw action being taken to ensure that others would not face similar injustice. Isabella Morales, her camera discreetly recording, captured the nuanced expressions of passengers as they absorbed Malcolm's words. The murmurs, the soft nods, and the occasional whispered acknowledgement were all testimony to the impact of truth and courage on the collective conscience. "This is more than a story," she whispered to herself. "It's a blueprint for systemic accountability." George Whitman exhaled slowly, the weight of past inaction pressing lightly on his conscience. He had observed injustices over decades and remained silent. But now he felt a subtle shift, a quiet hope that witnessing courage and integrity could inspire meaningful change in himself and others. Naomi Fields adjusted her stance near the aisle, feeling a quiet surge of affirmation. Her presence had been understated but significant, and the restoration of fairness reinforced the value of observation, integrity, and timely intervention. Lila Chen moved efficiently through the cabin, checking on passengers, ensuring comfort, and subtly reinforcing the sense of security that had been restored. She offered Eli a gentle smile. "You are safe now, sir," she said quietly. Eli returned the smile, a faint but genuine expression that reflected relief, trust, and pride. Malcolm Rivers walked deliberately toward the front of the cabin, making eye contact with Heather Lawson and Jason Carter. "Your actions today have been observed, documented, and assessed," he said firmly. "We will implement corrective training, and every passenger interaction will now be guided by a framework that prevents prejudice from dictating authority. This is not optional." The cabin absorbed the declaration, the words carrying both accountability and reassurance. Eli Rivers took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the ordeal lift further. He opened his journal and wrote slowly, "Justice is not passive. It requires witnesses, courage, and action. Today, fairness was restored. Tomorrow, it will be protected." The words were deliberate, a quiet reflection of both personal resilience and systemic impact. Isabella Morales adjusted her camera slightly, capturing the shift in energy. Passengers' expressions had transformed from tension and uncertainty to subtle acknowledgement and quiet approval. Some exchanged glances, nodding softly, their own sense of moral clarity reinforced by the unfolding example. George Whitman's eyes glimmered with a faint, reflective smile, a personal acknowledgement of the power of courage and accountability. Naomi Fields exhaled once more, relief and validation intertwining in her chest. Malcolm Rivers returned to Eli's side, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "Courage, integrity, and observation. These are your tools," he said softly. "You have used them well, but change requires more than personal courage. It requires systemic action. Today, we began that process." Eli nodded, absorbing both the weight and the empowerment of his father's words. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter, seated now with tense composure, absorbed the magnitude of the consequences. They understood that their actions had been corrected, but the moral lesson was indelible. Authority misused could be challenged effectively, and bias, even if unintentional, would no longer be tolerated in the presence of truth, witness, and action. Malcolm Rivers turned to the cabin once more, projecting calm authority. "Passengers, today you witnessed integrity, courage, and accountability in action. Let this be a reminder that respect is universal and dignity is inherent. Each of you as witnesses holds the power to recognize and challenge injustice when it arises." The cabin responded subtly soft applause, nods, and quiet acknowledgement as the words sank in, creating a sense of collective understanding and moral empowerment. Eli Rivers glanced at the passengers, noting the small gestures of acknowledgement, and then returned his gaze to his father. The journey had been intense, but in this moment, he felt a profound sense of validation. Every lesson, every whisper, every deliberate act of patience and courage had culminated in a quiet but powerful victory. The engines hummed steadily, the cabin infused with the subtle energy of moral clarity and reassurance. Lila Chen checked on Eli once more, ensuring he was comfortable and secure. The passengers, observing the resolution, returned to a quieter rhythm, the soft energy of support lingering in the air. Malcolm Rivers placed a hand gently on Eli's shoulder, signaling both reassurance and the ongoing commitment to fairness and systemic change. The cabin's energy shifted subtly as the initial tension began to give way to a sense of anticipation and moral clarity. Eli Rivers sat back in seat 1B, journal in his lap, the leather seat beneath him now a quiet sanctuary rather than a site of humiliation. His small hands traced the edges of the pages, feeling the weight of every word he had written and the courage it represented. Malcolm Rivers, standing near the aisle, allowed his gaze to sweep across the passengers. Each subtle nod, each quiet murmur, reflected the ripple effect of integrity and courage in motion. You all witnessed what happens when truth is met with calm action, he said softly but firmly. Now, you carry a responsibility to speak up, to support, and to ensure fairness wherever it is challenged. Heather Lawson, seated tensely, avoided direct eye contact with anyone. The shift in the cabin's collective gaze left her feeling exposed and accountable. Every whisper, every subtle glance from the passengers underscored the realization that her authority had been misapplied. Jason Carter's jaw tightened. A quiet acknowledgement passing between the two of them they had misjudged the situation, and the weight of that misjudgment was inescapable. Isabella Morales, keeping her phone discreetly recording, captured the micro-expressions across the cabin, passengers leaning in, whispering support, recording subtle gestures of empathy. She murmured softly to herself, "This moment is bigger than one flight. It's proof that witnessing courage matters, and speaking up can change the outcome." George Whitman exhaled quietly, reflecting on his own past silence. He realized that the act of witnessing, of acknowledging injustice, held its own moral power. He leaned slightly toward a neighboring passenger and whispered, "Sometimes, being silent is complicity. Today, I've seen what courage looks like." Naomi Fields, standing near the aisle, felt a quiet pride. The ordeal had underscored that observing, speaking, and acting in alignment with truth was essential, and she had been part of that chain. Lila Chen moved with composed efficiency, checking on Eli and the other passengers. "You're safe now," she said quietly to Eli, her tone both reassuring and respectful. Her calm demeanor reinforced the sense of order restored, allowing the passengers to settle while still processing the events that had unfolded. Malcolm Rivers knelt slightly beside Eli, whispering, "You've done more than sit in a seat today. You've shown that integrity, courage, and truth can influence everyone around you. This is the kind of power that changes systems, not just moments." Eli nodded, a small, quiet smile forming. The boy had endured humiliation and stress but emerged with dignity and tact, understanding that courage could ripple beyond the immediate. Passengers began to murmur more openly. A young woman near row 8 said softly, He didn't do anything wrong. He was calm and polite. Another passenger, leaning toward the aisle, added, "Finally, justice." Soft nods of agreement rippled across the cabin, creating a collective acknowledgement of fairness restored. Heather Lawson shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening in her lap. Jason Carter's posture remained rigid, the consequences of their actions now fully visible. Their authority had been challenged, and the moral clarity of Malcolm Rivers' presence left no room for defense. The cabin's subtle chorus of acknowledgement highlighted their errors and reinforced the necessity of reform. Malcolm Rivers straightened, projecting calm authority. This is more than a single incident. Today reveals systemic gaps that we must address. Training, review boards, and verification protocols will be updated immediately to ensure no passenger ever experiences discrimination or humiliation based on bias. His words resonated through the cabin, creating a palpable sense of accountability and reassurance. Eli Rivers opened his journal once more. Writing with deliberate strokes. Courage witnessed is courage amplified. Fairness is a responsibility we all share. Today, we begin systemic change. The act of writing solidified the lessons of the day, embedding a personal commitment to uphold dignity and inspire action in others. Isabella Morales whispered softly as she continued recording. This is a story people need to see: real courage, real accountability, and real change. George Whitman nodded subtly, realizing that witnessing justice could empower others, including himself, to act differently in future situations. Naomi Fields exhaled, her chest lighter, reinforced by the visible acknowledgement of ethical action. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm, yet the momentum of change lingered in the air. Every passenger had been a witness to courage, integrity, and accountability in motion. Malcolm Rivers stood beside Eli, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Change requires both courage and strategy. Today, you've embodied both, and we will ensure that this extends beyond this flight. Lila Chen checked on Eli one final time. "Everything is stable now," she whispered. Eli nodded, feeling the empowerment of dignity restored and the reassurance of witnessing moral action on a systemic scale. The passengers, too, absorbed the energy of fairness enforced and integrity displayed. Heather Lawson and Jason Carter sat quietly, their faces pale with recognition. They had misapplied authority and faced a moral reckoning, one amplified by witnesses and documentation. The passengers' subtle reactions, nods, and whispers ensured that the lessons of today would not be forgotten. Malcolm Rivers glanced once more across the cabin, the subtle shift in energy, the quiet acknowledgement from passengers, and the visible restoration of fairness reflected a moment of systemic impact. Eli Rivers, journal in hand, felt both relief and empowerment, understanding that his experience had sparked a broader reflection on accountability, dignity, and ethical action. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed steadily. Passengers leaned back, processing what they had witnessed, and the quiet energy of justice realized lingered in the air. Malcolm Rivers placed a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder, signaling both comfort and the ongoing commitment to systemic change. The moment was more than resolution. It was a blueprint for fairness and courage in action, leaving a subtle yet indelible imprint on everyone present. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady pulse beneath the lingering energy of the day's events. Eli Rivers, seated upright in 1B, journal open on his lap, felt a quiet satisfaction. The ordeal that had begun with humiliation had transformed into a moment of empowerment and systemic change. He looked around, noticing the subtle expressions on the passengers' faces, soft nods, whispered acknowledgement, and the faint glimmer of hope in their eyes. Malcolm Rivers stood tall in the aisle, projecting calm authority. He knew the journey was far from over, yet the foundation had been laid. Today, accountability had been enforced. Tomorrow, change would ripple far beyond this flight. Passengers, crew, and observers alike. He began, voice steady and clear. We have witnessed the power of dignity, courage, and truth, but this is only the beginning. Our responsibility extends beyond these walls, beyond a single flight, beyond this moment. Heather Lawson, seated with tension evident in every muscle, glanced around at the passengers. Their collective recognition of fairness and justice had eroded the authority she had wielded so confidently. Jason Carter remained silent, his usual composure fractured by the weight of accountability. Both understood that their actions had consequences, not merely personal but systemic, and that the lessons of this day would follow them indefinitely. Eli Rivers turned slightly toward Malcolm, eyes wide yet serene. "Dad, does this really change things?" he whispered. Malcolm knelt, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, Eli, today. Your courage sparked change, but we must ensure it lasts, embedded in systems, policies, and the culture of every institution it touches." Isabella Morales, her phone recording discreetly, captured the subtle shifts, the passengers' soft applause, the glances of acknowledgement, the quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. She whispered, "This story will travel far beyond this cabin. People will see that fairness, courage, and integrity matter." George Whitman, seated nearby, exhaled slowly. For decades, he had been silent in the face of injustice. Today, he had witnessed the restoration of dignity, and the experience left an indelible impression on his conscience. Naomi Fields stood at the aisle, observing the subtle energy of moral clarity permeating the cabin. She felt a deep sense of affirmation, realizing that her presence, her observation, and her willingness to act when needed had contributed to the restoration of justice. Lila Chen moved efficiently among passengers, ensuring comfort and reinforcing the sense of order restored. Her calm, respectful demeanor underscored the importance of dignity in every interaction. Malcolm Rivers addressed the cabin once more. "We will implement a framework of systemic change. Anti-bias training will be mandatory for all staff. Independent review boards will ensure accountability. Real-time verification systems will prevent prejudice from undermining integrity. Every passenger, every child, will be protected from humiliation or dismissal based on bias." The cabin absorbed his words, the energy shifting from tension to empowerment. Soft applause and murmurs of agreement spread through the rows, a testament to collective acknowledgement and support. Eli Rivers opened his journal, writing carefully. Courage inspires change. Witnesses amplify justice. Integrity becomes policy when actions follow truth. Each word was deliberate, a reflection of the journey from humiliation to empowerment and the broader systemic transformation underway. Heather Lawson's gaze fell to her hands. The recognition of her errors, the documented evidence, and the passenger's silent judgment crystallized the impact of accountability. Jason Carter's expression mirrored hers, a quiet, profound understanding that authority untempered by moral clarity could not withstand the light of truth. Malcolm Rivers crouched slightly, looking directly at Eli. Remember, courage is not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how steadfastly you uphold integrity when challenged. You have shown that today, and now, the systems around you will carry that lesson forward. Eli nodded, absorbing the gravity and empowerment of the moment. Isabella Morales whispered softly, recording the scene. This will inspire change beyond the headlines. People will see that even a child's courage can spark systemic reform. George Whitman's expression softened, a faint smile forming as he realized that witnessing courage could inspire moral reflection and action within himself and others. Naomi Fields exhaled, heart steady, reassured that her role as a witness and participant had meaning beyond the immediate situation. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over passengers and crew alike. Lila Chen moved through the rows one final time, offering subtle gestures of reassurance, ensuring that the restored dignity was felt by all. The hum of engines provided a steady rhythm beneath the quiet energy of moral clarity, reinforcing that today had shifted the balance of power in the cabin, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. Malcolm Rivers addressed Heather Lawson and Jason Carter directly. You have witnessed what happens when authority is misapplied and bias influences decisions. Your future actions will be guided by accountability and integrity, and you will contribute to a culture that respects every individual. Both nodded, understanding the scope of their responsibility and the indelible impact of today's lessons. Eli Rivers, journal closed, looked out the window, watching the clouds drift past. His small hands tightened slightly on the edges of the leather seat. He felt pride, relief, and a quiet sense of empowerment. The journey from humiliation to restoration had not only affirmed his dignity but had ignited a broader awareness of justice, fairness, and systemic change. Malcolm Rivers stood tall, surveying the cabin one last time. The subtle nods, whispers, and gestures of acknowledgement from passengers reinforced the permanence of the moment. Today, he said softly, we witnessed that integrity, courage, and truth are stronger than bias, and when paired with systemic action, they create lasting change. The cabin responded with soft applause, the energy shifting from tension and fear to quiet empowerment and hope. Eli Rivers glanced at his father, understanding that the ordeal had transformed him from a passive passenger into a catalyst for broader change. The passengers, crew, and witnesses absorbed the lesson. Dignity is inherent, courage is transformative, and accountability is essential. As the plane cruised steadily, the ripple effects of the confrontation extended beyond the cabin. Isabella Morales quietly reviewed her recordings, preparing to share the story widely, ensuring that the lesson of Eli Rivers' courage and Malcolm Rivers' leadership reached audiences far beyond this flight. George Whitman reflected on his own moral responsibility, while Naomi Fields and Lila Chen absorbed the lessons of integrity and action. Eli Rivers leaned back, journal in lap, smiling faintly. "We did it," he whispered to Malcolm. Malcolm nodded, placing a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Yes, Eli, and this is just the beginning. Your courage will inspire fairness wherever it is challenged." The cabin hummed quietly, infused with the resonance of dignity, integrity, and hope, a lasting testament to the power of courage and systemic change. The story of Eli Rivers and Malcolm Rivers carries lessons that extend far beyond the cabin of a plane. It reminds us that dignity is inherent, not granted, and that fairness must be actively defended, even when systems or authority figures fail. Courage is not always loud. It often manifests in quiet resilience, careful observation, and the decision to act with integrity despite fear or uncertainty. We learn the importance of standing up for those who cannot defend themselves, and of using influence responsibly to create systemic change. Witnessing injustice and choosing to respond can inspire collective accountability, encouraging others to act with empathy and courage. Even small actions, when guided by truth, can ripple outward to produce real, meaningful reform. For older audiences, the lesson is clear life often presents situations where your integrity is tested, and your response can leave a lasting impact. It encourages reflection on past moments of inaction, inviting us to choose differently in the future. Ultimately, this story teaches that fairness, respect, and moral courage are not just ideals. They are responsibilities we carry in every interaction, and they can transform both personal and collective experience. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If Eli and Malcolm's story inspired you, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can spread lessons of courage, fairness, and dignity, and make sure these stories continue to inspire change.